May Allah's peace, mercy, and blessing be upon all of you. Secondly, I would like to thank our speakers for giving up their time and attending this event, and especially Dr. Robert Stovold, I hope I pronounced it right, for coming here at such a short notice. The topic of today's event is New Morals Require God. So I would like to introduce our first speaker. His name is Dr. Robert Stovold. Dr. Stovold's childhood fascination for nature would later give rise to 3 degrees in the biological sciences, with research topics ranging from the earthy, the burrowing behavior of earthworms, to the profound why haven't things evolved to live forever. From his early doorstep encounters with Jehovah's Witnesses to his more recent discussions with Oxford professors of philosophy and theology, Dr. Stovold is well placed to describe what happens when a scientist begins asking fundamental questions. Dr. Stovold is a member of the National Secular Society, which campaigns against religious power-seeking and in favor of a level playing field for people of all faiths and none. So I would like to welcome him to come to the
Do morals require God? Moses is a key figure in all 3 Abrahamic faiths. The Old Testament tells the story of how a God called Jehovah gave the 10 Commandments to Moses, but there are several problems with this story. Firstly, it's suspiciously similar to stories from neighbouring cultures that are much older. The Babylonians, for example, believed that a god called Shamash presented laws to a man called Hammurabi, and Hammurabi lived about 300 years before the time of Moses. Which story is true? I think neither. If we get our standards from God, from where did God get his standards? If God invented goodness, there must have been a time when God wasn't good. If God has always been good, he never invented the concept of goodness. If God defined goodness, it turns out that he's also responsible for defining evil, because good and evil, they're opposite sides of the same coin. It might be argued that evil is simply a lack of goodness and therefore not something defined by God. But if that's the case, inanimate objects like stones must be evil. After all, they can hardly be said to be good. It might be argued that although God's definitions make evil possible in principle, that potential for evil is only realised by other agents later on, when rebellious people or spirits freely choose to disobey God. But that doesn't actually get God off the hook as far as evil is concerned. If God is all-knowing, he knows what agents will freely choose to do. He created people knowing full well the evil that would result. And God therefore bears as much responsibility for the evil acts as the people who actually commit them. There's another problem with the alleged link between God and morality. Suppose I was quite a slow runner, but am now the fastest runner in the world. You'd probably admire me. After all, it takes a great deal of hard work to become able to run faster than anybody else. But if God has always been good, then his goodness was never acquired, never earned. Why worship a God who can't help but be good? As I understand it, the Quran, like the Bible, holds that human morality is fragile because people can be tempted to do the wrong thing. Well, although I favour a secular basis for ethics, I agree that morality is fragile. There are selfish and unselfish impulses within us, and morality is fragile because of the tension between these 2 elements. But it's this very tension that means that we deserve credit for doing the right thing. If we found it easy to do the right thing, why should we deserve credit for it? If God finds it easy to do the right thing, Why should we give him credit for it? If, on the other hand, God finds it very difficult to do the right thing, that implies there's some kind of conflict within him, that God has selfish drives, albeit ones that never actually succeed in overpowering the unselfish drives. Yet I suspect this kind of conflict is not what most believers have in mind when they think of God. Well, now we move on to a different question. What is it that makes an action good? Let's suppose that an action is good ultimately because God says it is, and something is bad ultimately because God says it is. Why is murder wrong? Well, ultimately because God said so. Why is stealing a pencil wrong? Well, ultimately because God said so. But hang on a minute. If murder is wrong because God said so, and stealing a pencil is wrong because God said so, and that's all there is to it, murder and stealing a pencil turn out to be wrong for exactly the same reason, which implies that one act is no worse than the other. There must be something more to morality than it's good because God said so. Otherwise, the statement, God is good, means only God is approved of by God. It conveys no useful meaning. We instinctively feel that murder is worse than stealing. Why might this be? Stolen money can be repaid, but the dead can't be brought back to life. But hang on a minute. If you're God, things can be brought back to life. Anything can be replaced without breaking into a sweat, merely by willing it to be so. It's difficult to see why, in God's eyes, things should have value at all. They're so easy to replace. Perhaps God's connection to morality is more practical. Okay, so God didn't actually invent goodness, but he does play a useful role in communicating to us which things are good and which things aren't. The problem with this idea should be obvious. There's disagreement both within and between religious traditions concerning what's right and what's wrong. In the Old Testament, God sanctions slavery, punishes people for the crimes committed by their ancestors, and raises an army against his own people in the knowledge that the women will be starved to such an extent that they'll be forced to eat their own children. Periods are sinful, and ladies, you must sacrifice 2 doves every time you have one. Even in the New Testament we read that a man who offers up his virgin daughters to be raped by a mob is righteous, that homosexuality is deserving of death, and that all unbelievers will be tortured forever in hell. Let's take a look now at the New Testament take on morality. James 2:10 implies that all laws are equally important. Whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. So it looks as though stealing a pencil really is as bad as murdering someone. In Matthew 23:23, Jesus muddies the waters by implying that while all laws are not equally important, they should all be kept. You give a tenth for your spices, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the former without neglecting the latter. But in Matthew 19:17-19, Jesus says only some commandments should be kept. When he's asked, he says, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not give false testimony, honour your father and your mother, and love your neighbour as yourself. Jesus here omits love God, one of the 10 commandments, which Jesus elsewhere called the greatest commandment. In Mark's account of the same event, Jesus adds defraud not to the list, which isn't one of the 10 commandments, and omits love your neighbour as yourself, a command which we're elsewhere told sums up the entire law. The idea that you should treat your neighbour as you would like to be treated is called the Golden Rule, and it lies at the heart of most religions. It's not an infallible recipe for harmony, because different people have different tastes. However, it's still a very useful basis for ethics, because few people enjoy being the victims of violence, or being lied to, or being stolen from. The Christian formulation of the Golden Rule, though, love your neighbour as yourself, is problematic. as an agnostic called Robert Ingersoll pointed out, taste and love are not the servants of the will. One cannot be compelled to love. Perhaps God's connection to morality lies not so much in the generation of moral codes, but in their enforcement. This way of thinking holds that God is a kind of invisible security camera, the ultimate crime deterrent. But if you obey the law only because you're scared of being caught, the goodness that results from God's watching eye is not genuine. Arguably, it's not fear of God that exerts an influence, it's fear of his more fanatical followers. People mock Christianity today in a way in which they dare not mock Islam, despite the fact that there are many more Christians around than Muslims. I hope by now that you can see that the relationship between God and morality is problematic. But if God is not the source of our ethical standards, where do we get our ethical standards from? Some people believe that morals do require God. Many of them will probably agree with Jean-Paul Sartre's remark, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. Without God, all things may well be permitted, but that does not mean that all things are equally useful. To begin with a rather obvious example, there are, as far as I'm aware, no secular or even religious laws that mandate walking forwards or prohibit walking backwards. And yet we all tend to walk forwards for most of the time, even godless types like Richard Dawkins. The reason for this is pretty obvious. Regardless of your culture or religion, if you look backwards you can't see where you're going and you risk falling over. It's just not a useful thing for an organism to do. But what exactly do we mean by useful? Well, that depends on your environment. Gills are useful if you're a fish, but are of no use if you live on land. If you lived by yourself on a desert island, you'd have no need for morals. You couldn't do anything that was right and you couldn't do anything that was wrong. Morals are useful only because human beings are social animals. If you live in a group, it's important to be able to get along with other individuals. And no one likes being stolen to or assaulted or lied to. Any individual who did would be at a disadvantage compared to other individuals within the group. Morals, then, are useful adaptations for group life. Before Charles Darwin's time, the only explanation we had for the appearance of design in nature was that God did it. But Darwin offered a natural explanation for the origin of useful adaptation, evolution by natural selection. When you think about evolution, you probably think of changes in the bodies of animals, a fish crawling up onto land and over thousands of generations becoming amphibians, for example. But and that's probably because physical bodies fossilise, behaviour doesn't. Another example of a change would be sort of ape-like humans, ape-like animals evolving into people. Again, we can see evidence for that in a fragmentary fossil record, but we have to infer behaviour. We can't study the behaviour of dead things, obviously. Behaviour, though, can be observed objectively in the laboratory. It is part of scientific study. Some behaviours are known to have a genetic basis, some are known to be learnt, some are a combination of the two. For example, the language that we learn is obviously determined by the language spoken by the people around us and not by our genes directly. However, the general capacity to speak and learn language is genetically hardwired. Deaf babies instinctively babble and experiment with speech, despite the fact they've never been able to hear anything. Evolution often gets a bad press from those who don't understand it, but biologists know that evolved behaviours don't have to result in selfish individuals. Slime moulds are remarkable organisms. When times are good, they wander around as individual amoeba-like cells. When times are harsh, their behaviour changes completely. They coalesce to form a multicellular organism that looks a bit like a slug, and their cells cooperate in a very intimate way to bring this about. Going into the general election, Nick Clegg and David Cameron were sworn enemies who found it useful to stress what divided them. Within the politically harsh climate of a hung parliament, they needed one another and found it useful to get along. Politicians plan for the future and slimebulbs don't, but that fact is irrelevant to the point I want to make here, namely that cooperation can be useful in some environments. It's therefore something you can expect evolution to favour sometimes, without recourse to any holy text. To give a simple example of unselfish behaviour, parents, particularly mothers, give resources to their offspring instead of keeping the resources for themselves. Why do they do that? Because a parent's unselfish behaviour generates the copies of the genes that live in its offspring. By being nice to its offspring, a gene will usually be being nice to itself, or at least to an identical copy of itself. It's selfish behaviour then from a gene's point of view, and that's what matters in evolution, but it's not selfish from the point of view of the individual. There are all kinds of life histories you can make sense of by reference to selfish genes. My favourite example is something called the Thrix egg mite. The male mates with its sisters while it's still inside its mother and dies before it's born. The mother is eaten alive from the inside by her own daughters and dies when she's 4 days old. All things bright and beautiful, all creatures great and small, all things wise and wonderful, the Lord God made them all. Worker bees are more closely related to their own sisters than they would be to their own offspring. And this genetic quirk explains why they're willing to die in defense of their hive. They're nature's original suicide bombers, and again had no holy text to guide them. Evolution can favour cooperation even between unrelated individuals. Chimpanzees exhibit what's known as reciprocal altruism. They have a cooperative rule called you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. But if evolution can produce such unselfish behaviour, why do we still see selfishness? Cheating can be adaptive for an individual in the short term, provided it's not found out, because stealing something can be easier than earning it fairly. You scratched my back, great. Now I'll save my time and energy by not scratching yours. Once individuals are being exploited by cheats, though, we might expect individuals to evolve ways of dealing with them. No one likes being taken for a ride, and more to the point, it's not useful to be taken for a ride. Accordingly, chimpanzees detect cheats and then punish them. I scratched your back, you didn't scratch mine, so I'm not going to bother scratching your back again. And when other members of the group hear about this, they won't bother scratching your back either. These kinds of rules are only possible among intelligent animals living in small, stable groups over a long period of time. And they've been observed in birds, wolves, dolphins, monkeys, apes, and of course, people. Reciprocal altruism is reliant upon the fact that all members of a society can see and identify one another as individuals. If chimpanzees were to don burqas, it's a pretty good bet that this system would break down. There's another mechanism underlying morality which I haven't mentioned yet, the ability to empathise. Human beings live in groups. Wouldn't it be useful to be able to read another person's mind and work out what they're up to? You could use that knowledge to help them, or you could use it to outcompete them. Either way, it's a very useful thing to be able to do. Human beings can't read minds, of course, but they do have a sense of empathy. We can put ourselves in somebody else's shoes and so imagine what that person might be feeling. The ability to empathise, whether it evolved for selfish reasons or unselfish ones, has a very important consequence. If we hurt other people, we can't help but identify with them to a degree, and we are, in a sense, hurting a part of ourselves. Empathy acts as a natural break to selfish or aggressive behaviour. It's only a very short step from think of your neighbour as yourself to treat your neighbour as yourself. Because once we empathise with other people, we feel awkward about treating them badly. The idea that other people are like us is simple. Once we start assuming that people are different, this raises all kinds of additional questions. In what way do they differ? By how much do they differ? Why do they differ? And so on. Human societies enforce man-made rules through the use of the police and the legal system. Contrary to what some religionists say, it's not necessary to believe in God in order to live a moral life. As I said earlier, at the heart of all religions is the golden rule. Treat your neighbour as yourself. But that rule is secular. It makes no mention to God whatsoever. I therefore encourage you to think carefully for yourselves about what's right and wrong, to rely on shared human values of reason, evidence and compassion in this changing world, and not to rely on divisive, static religious traditions. Thank you.
Now I would like to welcome Brother